I got a question for you. What were you up to 60 years ago? For most of you, the answer there is probably going to be the same as mine, which is I was still dead back then. I don't know. I don't remember nothing. But some of you probably are like, oh, I was a little kid. I have a few vague memories of 60 years ago. Others of you are like, oh, I remember it pretty well. I was a young man. I was a young woman. This is what I was up to at that point early on in my life. But even if you're like me and you don't have, you weren't alive during that time or close to alive, you can still kind of feel it, right? Like I can feel the 60s and I can feel the 70s. My memories don't start to come online until the 80s. They really began to come into focus in the mid 80s. And I remember culture and things like that from getting more toward the late 80s. I really like 80s music and culture, but a lot of that is kind of funny. It kind of happened after the fact because we didn't really do a lot of media and culture when I was a kid. It was sort of that age of Christianity where you avoid things unless they're very old. And so I had a big appetite to go and consume all the culture of the first decade I was aware of a little bit later on in the early 90s. So I'm wired a little strange that way. But the point is, even the stuff that is before I remember, I still feel it. There's still legacy memory there. There's generational memory there. I can still sort of sense what the 60s and the 70s felt like. And to a little lesser extent, I can kind of feel the 50s. I can't really feel the 40s other than vicariously through music and stuff like that. There's just a big enough cultural gap, I suppose. But I'm guessing that all of you are filling in your own numbers right now as we're sitting here talking about it. And I'm guessing that you're running the equation in your brain of like, okay, well, what's the furthest back that I can feel before I was alive? What's the furthest thing back that I feel nostalgia for, even though I wasn't there for it? And maybe for you, it goes back a little further than me. Maybe it goes a little bit less. Whatever the case, you can picture the dynamics of the last 30, 40, 50, 60, maybe more years, because it's close enough to you that you can feel the dynamics of it. You can sense the way that the music and the art and the advertising and the television and the political language and the pressures and the social mores and what's offensive and what's not, and the ethics about dating and love and the sensibilities about church and travel and just everything. You can feel that has changed a ton in very recent times, and you can use that to kind of triangulate a sense of the passage of time in your brain. And I am fascinated by the passage of time and the way we conceive of it. I'm also fascinated by how quickly our ability to conceive of the passage of time in the past drops off after 60, 70, 80, 100 years. Once we can't feel it anymore, our compass really spins. And so the last 60 years, no problem. But if you go back, say, 2,500 years ago, and then you try to go 60 more years past that, and you're like, oh, well, how's that different from 2,560 years ago? Well, you got nothing. I got nothing. And I went to school for history for a long time. I'm really into this stuff. I don't know. I don't feel it back then. It's all books. It's all guesswork and trying to cobble it together. And even here with what we're looking at with the age of Cyrus and Ezra and Nehemiah and Esther and Darius and Xerxes and Artaxerxes, even here, we don't have that much. And this is one of the most well-documented stretches of the super ancient world that we get anywhere. So we don't feel it. And as a result, when we run into a 60-year passage of time between Ezra 6 and Ezra 7, I just don't think we have any intuitive ability to feel that passage of time, let alone grieve that passage of time the way we would grieve it if suddenly we woke up and 60 years had gone by right now. It just sort of happens. We go from one part of Persia we don't know a lot about to another part of Persia we don't know a lot about. But what I got to ask us to try to do with our next few conversations is try to apply our sense of the dynamics of time and how much things have changed and nostalgia and feeling the passage of time to this moment in history back here spanning the end of the 500s at the beginning of the 400s BC, because we're about to take a huge leap forward in this story and the world is going to change as it does. In Ezra 6:22, is that right? 22? Is that the last verse? A second, now I got to look. Yeah, it was 22. This represents the end of Act 3, the conclusion of the opening story of the book of Ezra and Nehemiah. This is the one we've been looking at for a while. It's the story of the building of the temple. It wraps up in 516-ish BC. And then we jump forward 57, 58 years. I've been saying 60. I'm just rounding to make it easy. 57 or 58 years into the lifetime of Ezra, the title character of the book, and into the lifetime of Nehemiah, the title character of the next book. And as we make that leap, a ton of things happen. In the same way that Joseph went to Egypt in the end of Genesis and curried favor, and the Pharaoh liked him, but then he got old and he died, and generations went by and everybody forgot about Joseph and all that he had contributed to the good of the city, to the good of Egypt, and his descendants ended up in a really bad spot. So that happens very quickly in this passage of 60 years that we're looking at right here. It seems like, based on what we just saw in this temple rebuild story, the Jews are in great shape. Cyrus liked them. Darius liked them. Darius, as we talked about, I think yesterday, had this habit of trying to emphasize that whatever the last king said, the next king should also think, to prop up himself and his descendants who were to later sit on the throne. So it just looks like this should go great for the Jewish people. But it doesn't. Darius has a rough home stretch to his reign in the 490s BC. He's trying to be the king of kings and conquer the world and say that Ahura Mazda, the great god of Zoroastrianism and the Persians in general, has chosen him and selected him to unify the whole world, but he can't beat the Greeks. And this sticks in his craw. And then he dies, and his young kid takes over, Xerxes. And Xerxes is real headstrong. He's trained in the Persian style of princes, which we actually know quite a bit about. And he's like, all right, I got to go avenge my dad. So I got to go invade Greece. And the beginning of the book of Esther is him planning that invasion. And that book, of course, demonstrates that Xerxes is youthful and silly. As the incident with his wife Vashti unfolds, I got some really good pushback on that the other day, by the way, from a very thoughtful commenter over on the subreddit who argued another way of reading that. And I thought it was really smart. No time to get into it now. That ship has sailed, but it's a good argument. It's a good thought. Whoever you were, thank you for that. And Xerxes finishes up that war council, wifeless, or maybe down one wife from his roster of wives, and he goes and meets the same fate his dad does. He loses. I mean, they both get out alive, but they both suffer badly in terms of their reputation and their finances, and any hope of a Western conquest of the Greeks is over by 480 BC. Xerxes comes back despondent, and his helpers, the eunuchs around the palace, are like, we got to help this guy out. He's losing his mind. He's a mess. He's full of sexual chaos. He's going to wreck everything. We got to get him a good wife that can soothe the beast so that the beast can become a man again and properly guide the kingdom. All of our fate is hitched to him. Paraphrase is mine, but I think that's what they were thinking. So they throw a contest amongst all the virgins that they pick who are the prettiest and the bestest that they think might be the best fit. And of course, the secret Jew, Esther, wins. And then as the story unfolds, she is properly positioned along with her cousin and guardian Mordecai to outfox and outmaneuver the evil Haman who wants to destroy the Jews. And Xerxes, whether intentionally or not, in the 470s, signs off on this. That's insane. Think about the letter that we just read. I mean, how many pages ago is this from Darius? It's one page. It's only one page. Are you kidding me? And in that letter, you get all this stuff from Darius about we're going to stick people through with a pole if they oppose what God has ordained to rebuild the temple. Nobody should oppose these people. I'm going to pay for it. Cyrus wanted it, therefore I want it. And because if we both want it, that means the great Ahura Mazda wants it. God demands it. We're doing this thing. And just one generation of leadership later, you're talking about less than 30 years. Think about where you were 30 years ago. It's not that long ago. Just that much later, the Jews are a hair's breadth from being wiped out completely in a gigantic genocide that is ordained, ordered, signed, sealed, and delivered by the king himself, Darius's son himself. Well, as we've discussed a whole lot in the course of our conversations together, my friends, God without even being mentioned, prevails, using the positioning and the character of Esther and Mordecai to pull off the surprise reversal win. And after that, Persia thrives under the right-hand man of the king, Mordecai, a Jew who everybody knows is a Jew. So you would think that now again, everybody's going to be like, okay, we got to quit sleeping on the Jews. These are really good members of society. And, I heard a rumor once that one of their prophets, back before the Babylonians were even a thing, said, you're going to get taken into captivity. It's going to be a rough time, but go work for the good of the city. And wow, did they ever listen to their God and do that? We should be really thankful that in our grand cosmopolitan empire, we have Jews because they just kick butt and they're great. And we should root for them in the rebuilding of their temple thing or whatever it is they're doing over there because of how much they've done to build up Persian civilization as well. You would think that, but that isn't how it plays out at all. Instead, as we saw again, a few pages back now, the resistance to the Jews makes it to the throne of Artaxerxes, the son of Xerxes, who dies in 465 BC. So Artaxerxes becomes king in 465 BC after a pretty weird scrap for power after Xerxes is murdered. In the end, Artaxerxes wins out and puts together the fourth consecutive, and really, this is why Persia is a name that you and I still know. It's because they just won the lottery on their first four big kings, Cyrus, Darius, Xerxes, Artaxerxes. Nobody strings together four leaders that good right in a row, or basically right in a row. That's the 60 years of history that have passed. And I would say we need to try to, again, apply an empathetic view to those 60 years. We need to try to think about how much has changed and how different things feel, not just are, but feel in the last 60 years, how many things have come and gone in and out of fashion in the last 60 years, how many current things have come and gone that we were all supposed to support and believe and rally around, and how many of those ended up being debunked, and how many of those stood the test of time and really did change things. So much stuff has happened. Let's try to imagine that the people back then in Persia and in Jerusalem between 516 and the mid-400s BC lived in a sophisticated time as sophisticated people just like us, and take an empathetic view of what this passage of time that happens between the end of Ezra 6 and the beginning of Ezra 7 would have had on them. And now that we've accounted for this passage of time, tomorrow it's time to meet the title character of the book. It's time to meet Ezra and find out why he is a really big deal and how he's going to affect the unfolding of the rest of this story. All right, I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Let's do this again soon.